We're back. The war in Iraq officially ended today for America. In Baghdad, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta thanked the more than 1 million Americans, believe it or not, who have served in Iraq over the last 9 years. Let's watch.
To all of the men and women in uniform today, your nation is deeply indebted to you. Your dedication, your commitment to this mission has been the driving force behind the remarkable progress that we've seen here in Baghdad and across this country.
Well, the war was initially justified for some as an effort to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. I never believed all these cases anyway, which, of course, the country didn't possess in the first place. About 4,500 Americans gave their lives in that effort over there. An additional 32,000 were wounded. The war cost nearly $1 trillion for us. To this day, it's impossible to look at these numbers and not ask the simple question, was it worth it? Was it the right war to fight? Kimberly Dozier covered the war for CBS News. She was severely wounded by a car bomb, an experience she writes about in her book, Breathing the Fire, Fighting to Survive and Get Back to the Fight. She now covers the intelligence community for the Associated Press. And Bob Herbert is a distinguished senior fellow at Demos. He was a longtime columnist for the New York Times. Kimberly, thank you for joining us. And I guess is there any way to answer that question objectively? If you, I look back on the polling that went on back at the time we went into the war. It sort of was against it. It said, let's go the diplomatic route. There may be a poll or two that showed we should go in if the casualties are light and it's a short war. I don't think anyone ever proposed the idea of a decade-long war with these kinds of casualties.
I think you got to look at it in a different way. Instead of was it worth it going in, what did we salvage from it? Once military commanders were in there, what did they learn from the mistakes we made, the way they tried to solve it with brute force and learned can't work that way. You got to work by, with, and through the local population, something that was an old special operations dictum for years. Now they're applying that in Afghanistan. Another lesson they learned was how you catch terrorist suspects. The way General Stan McChrystal and the intelligence community worked the system to learn to work together and hunt terrorists from hiding spot to the next hiding spot to the next hiding spot, sometimes in a single night. That science is now being used to catch, it tracked down Osama bin Laden. It's the way they got Anwar al-Awlaki. So you have to say, not was it worth going in, but what did we make of what many people now say was a mistake?
Well, let's take a look at these statistics from a CBS poll last month. It asked whether the outcome of the war was worth the cost in lives and treasure. A strong majority said no, it was not worth it. Look at those numbers. Bob, I do remember the polling in the beginning of the war, and it was never for a hawkish position. My question to you is philosophical. I've always taken pride that this country was not an aggressive country. We don't start wars. We defend ourselves. The Department of Defense is just that. An institution to defend this country, not in an isolationist way, a thoughtful way. But we're not an aggressive power. This war always looked like to me an invasion of another country that never attacked us, overthrowing the government at our will, using our force, forcing the people of that country at gunpoint to do what we wanted them to do for many years. I consider it an aggressive action. The American people didn't like it. I think there's more to this than just the data. I think it gets down to values, too. But your thoughts?
Chris, I couldn't agree with you more. I believe that 100% and said so before we invaded Iraq. And that's why that's the starting point for everything going so haywire. I think the war was a world-class disaster for the United States, not to mention for Iraq, from day one. In addition to the 4,500 Americans, men and women that we lost, we took our eye off of Afghanistan, which is the reason why we've stayed in Afghanistan for more than a decade. And Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, estimates that ultimately the war in Iraq and Afghanistan will cost the U.S. more than $4 trillion when you take in the long-term care, for example, for all the wounded soldiers and Marines and the impact on the American deficits. It's just been an immense tragedy and a world-class disaster, I think, no matter how you look at it.
We're looking at footage here, obviously, of the American military beginning the process, or actually carrying out the process of leaving that country. Here's Senator John McCain with a very different view than the one we just expressed, or I just did. And Bob, just did. He's been one of the president's toughest critics on the Iraq policy. He said President Obama should have pushed to keep a residual force in the country for the foreseeable future. Keep in mind the timeline for troop withdrawal goes back to an agreement reached with the Iraqi government back in 2008 when George W. Bush was still in office. However, here was Senator McCain yesterday with some very strong words on President Obama.
It is clear that this decision of a complete pullout of United States troops from Iraq was dictated by politics and not our national security interests. I believe that history will judge this president's leadership with the scorn and disdain that it deserves.
Kimberly, I think one of the questions, I want to get to Kimberly first, is this whole question, can we engage in a war and actually end it? The old question of Colin Powell, can you have an exit strategy? We left. Was that in itself a good exercise, being able to leave?
There was an independent Iraqi government that told us to leave.
That's a good sign.
How could we stay?
I think that's a good point. We have to keep telling Senator McCain, we don't own these countries. They tell us when to leave.